Hello, everyone. Hello, hello, hello. Before I forget, if you want to flip off your cell phone, that would be lovely if you have to do that. Thank you. So good evening and welcome to the Harry Ransom Center. Tonight we're very pleased to welcome Nigel Cliff, who will be speaking on the role Shakespeare played in constructing American history, or American identity, and how tensions over this ignited in 1849 with the riots at the Astor Theater in New York City. Tonight's talk is part of an ongoing series of public programs connected to the 400th anniversary of the death of Shakespeare this year. I invite you to pick up a calendar in the lobby after tonight's program and join us again in the next week for our discussion with Professor Andrew Carlson on Shakespeare's texts and performance, and each Thursday in May for our Shakespeare film series. Please do check those out. I have to confess, I first read Cliff's book, The Shakespeare Riots, several years ago with a little bit of reluctance. And after years of studying theater history, and those of you who have been there, you know why. There's this, perhaps after the Restoration period, the second most driest sort of period in theater history classes tends to be 19th century American theater. So I was a little bit reluctant. But I was incredibly wrong, and I'm so glad that I did pick it up. It is an incredible book. It opened up an entire century of theater history in such a compelling and engaging way that I've never looked at it in the same way since. Stories of hoodlum gangs running around town buying up theater tickets so they can jeer their least favorite actors while they perform on stage. How the introduction of the showboat brought a new and unique style to the American theater, or how rough and gruff Western settlers saw something of the pioneer spirit in the many plays of Shakespeare. And then, of course, there's the Astor Riots, which were anything but dry and uneventful. The Shakespeare Riots is a remarkable work of social and cultural history. It was a finalist for the National Award for Arts Writing and was selected as one of the best nonfiction books of 2007 by the Washington Post. And since then, he's traveled a bit further back in time with his book, The Last Crusade, The Epic Voyages of Vasco da Gama, which was shortlisted for the 2011 Penn Hessel Tiltman Prize. Most recently, Penguin Classics published his new translation of Marco Polo's Travels in 2015, the first completely new translation of this important book in over 50 years. And believe it or not, he has another book coming out later this year, and perhaps he'll be able to tell us a little bit about it in the question and answer session after his talk. So please join me in welcoming Nigel Cliff.
Hi, thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Eric, for that introduction, which is going to make this speech a little bit harder to live up to. When I first came across this story, the series of events that I called the Shakespeare Riots, it's more often known as the Astor Place Riot, I thought, people dying over Shakespeare, it's too good to be true. I mean, this is the sort of thing as a writer that you really search for, and I was very lucky that it came my way. But as I went on with the research, I discovered there's more to the story than Shakespeare, but it wouldn't exist without Shakespeare, so I think it is reasonable to call it the Shakespeare Riots. The basic facts are these. In May 1849, England's foremost actor was performing Macbeth in New York when a third of the audience started chanting, "Down with the English hog," and drove him from the stage with a barrage of apples, eggs, potatoes, lemons, lumps of wood, an old shoe, bottles of stinking asafetida, and 3 wooden seats. 4 days later, he tried again, but a mob attacked the theatre with such fury that the military joined battle with them and shot at least 25 dead. Standing up here, I'm glad times have changed. But tonight, I want to take you back to an age before professional sports, when theatres were the great raucous gathering places in every town, where the people's voice was louder than the elites and the gods could sit in judgment on the wealthy folk below. And I also want to explain why that American age saw the zenith of Bardolatry, or the idolization of Shakespeare as a master spirit, and how it was that his universal appeal provoked the most lethal of all theatre riots. It seems particularly odd that Shakespeare was so popular in America when the United States and Great Britain were either at war or constantly threatened to be. Some of us tend to forget that hostilities didn't suddenly disappear at the end of the Revolutionary War. There was the little matter of the Second Anglo-American War, the War of 1812, when you may remember that English soldiers burned down the White House. And even after that, America and Britain remained, if not exactly enemies, then, I don't know, frenemies maybe, cousins divided by more than a common language. Territorial disputes and global rivalry were part of it, but another reason for the rancor was that English writers had discovered they could make a tidy sum of money by insulting America. Worst of the whole bunch was Fanny Trollope, who moaned endlessly about American table manners, American parties, American conversations, American consumerism, and above all, the American fondness for chewing tobacco and spitting out the results. Trollope called her book Domestic Manners of the Americans, and the thrust was they had none. I do not like them, she declared of Americans. I do not like their principles. I do not like their opinions. I do not like their manners. The essence of the book is really nice country, shame about the people. Now, there were some old money patricians in the eastern cities who saw much sense in what Mrs. Trollope said, but the vast majority were outraged. Americans, in Washington Irving's words, were exquisitely alive to the aspersions of England, and nothing stung more than taunts that they were uncultured upstarts. Mrs. Trollope was exhibited in a waxwork museum as a goblin and blown up in satires, cartoons, and even a quickstep. She did not succeed among us, the Cincinnati Gazette said, running with the possibilities of her unfortunate name. Her whole appearance and conduct corresponded with her name. The upshot was that mainstream Americans and the so-called respectable English loathed each other with what one writer, Captain Marryat, called a deep, irreconcilable hatred. And yet, any American who went to the theater, which was most people, had to put up with the fact that the American entertainment world was still run by the English. When I read back in the memoirs of actors from the time, I was really amazed by how many English troops ended up in America and the lengths they went to find an audience. In 1831, for instance, a strange little craft appeared on the Mississippi, a white pine raft with a ridge-roof shack on its back that looked rather like the rough boats called arks that pioneers knocked together to float themselves to their new patch of land. This one was missing a pen for its family's pigs and chickens, though the shack was a little larger than usual, and there was a flagpole flying a pennant poking through its roof with a few letters appliqued in red. They spelt theatre, for this was America's very first showboat. The floating theatre was the creation of the Chapman family troupe. The Chapmans had been well-known theatre folk back home in England, but the London stage was hopelessly congested, leaving them constantly on the edge of bankruptcy, and they set out for the Golden Yonder. Hauling the raft against the mighty current was back-breaking work, and occasionally they had to fire a round of buckshot to fend off outlaws and pirates. But it also gave them a direct line into an untapped and ever-growing market. Wherever they moored, an audience made its way by foot, wagon, or mule, and paid 50 cents a sack of potatoes or a side of bacon to cross the gangplank. The Chapmans were entertainment pioneers, but they were not unusual for being intrepid or for being English. Wherever there was an audience in America, there were English actors and English managers setting up theatres in a pig pen or a room above a brewery, or building theatres for the season and moving on. Half a century after independence, the American entertainment business was still virtually an English monopoly. Increasingly, there was a price to pay, not just the risk of yellow fever or malaria, or being cut up by the Indians or eaten by wolves, which happened to several of their predecessors. But whenever an anti-English feeling ran high, posters would go up calling on patriots to pelt the slanderer off the stage, and crowds 5,000 strong would batter down the doors and the windows of the theatre, throw coins, fruit, and eggs at the stage, and shout, "Off, off, go back to England." But most of the time, Americans simply took English actors for granted, like Italian waiters or Irish labourers. This was the state of affairs when a 14-year-old boy ran away from his Philadelphia home to seek his fortune on the stage. Edwin Forrest was a born actor, and he expected great things, but he soon found himself performing in conditions where it was hard to hear the play at all, let alone spot a talent, in makeshift theatres with leaking roofs where the audience put up umbrellas on rainy nights, or a hotel landing shared with passing guests, or one night when there were no candles in the dark. He lost his nerve and ran away to the circus, but a shrewd supporter tracked him down and put him on the boat to New Orleans, And there, among the deckhands, gamblers, and fighters on the docks, he found an audience. At 18, Forrest was all muscles and fire. He had a magnificent physique born of working out every day of his life, and a thunderous passion that made women faint. Here was an actor who was one of them, an actor for the America of Andrew Jackson, a patriotic, self-taught giant from the backwoods. Things went downhill when Forrest challenged the English manager of the New Orleans Theatre to a duel over a 20-year-old beauty from Charleston and ran away to spend several months living with the Choctaw tribe. But eventually, Forrest found another audience that adored him just as much on the Bowery, New York's great working-class entertainment strip. The Bowery was home to the famous Bahoys, with their, at least I think that's how you pronounce it, I've never quite known, but with their soap sidelocks, stovepipe hats, and muscular chests thrust through unbuttoned red shirts, and their gals, who sent up the latest fashions by dressing in spectacularly clashing colours, necklaces that looked like they were threaded with Christmas decorations, and hats stuffed with fake fruit. Bahoydom was America's first youth culture, and Forrest became their hero. Far beyond the Bowery, Americans who hungered for a national culture suddenly saw in him the chance to rid America of England's cultural hold on its old colony and allow the nation to forge its own style. The war for the country's emerging self-image was still being fought, and American culture was there for the defining. Well, the oracle had been found, but what was the message? The answer was, like the Chapmans and the other frontier troops, Forrest became most famous for playing Shakespearean roles, the great roles Othello, Lear, and Macbeth. In 19th century America, there was no getting away from Bardolatry. Literature, philosophy, and thought are Shakespearized, said Emerson. His mind is the horizon beyond which at present we do not see. Our ears are educated to music by his rhythm. Once Emerson went further and suggested that if there were aliens, they undoubtedly called the earth Shakespeare. But Shakespeare wasn't confined to educated circles. He was quite literally everywhere. In the 1830s, the 25-year-old Alexis de Tocqueville was astonished to find the bard in the recesses of the forests of the New World. I remember, he wrote, reading the feudal drama of Henry V for the first time in a log cabin. Jim Bridger, the greatest scout, trapper, and Indian fighter in the far west, owned a copy of Shakespeare, and Bridger was illiterate. He exchanged a yoke of cattle for the precious volume and hired a boy to read the plays for him for hours at a time. Soon he knew the speeches off by heart, and he'd reel them off around the campfires of the West, spicing them up every few words with an oath of his own. Even itinerant English actors were surprised by how far the Shakespeare craze went. They rumbled on their carts past mountain peaks, canyons, and mines, and whole towns named after the bard and his characters. They sailed on Shakespeare packets and steamers and rode down main streets boasting Shakespeare saloons plastered with advertisements for Shakespeare almanacs and Shakespeare patent medicines. They checked into the Shakespeare Hotel and turned up at the theatre to discover that at least a few townsfolk knew the plays better than themselves and could shout out the prompts to prove it. Sometimes a local would ask to try his hand at playing a favourite character, and he'd throw a spangled cloak over his boots, pistols and spurs, scrub on some whiskers with a burnt cork, and go on as Shylock or Richard III with his friends roaring their approval. Some spectators became so wrapped up in the action that they forgot they were watching a play at all. In Albany, a canal boatman was enraged by Iago's scheming. "You damn lying scoundrel," he roared. "I would like to get hold of you after the show and wring your infernal neck." This was really a revelation to me when I started researching this book. Nothing remotely similar was going on in England at the time, as far as I can tell from the record. Shakespeare was played everywhere, of course, but London was in the grip of a craze for lurid melodramas and wild animal acts. Even Queen Victoria managed to go 6 years without seeing a Shakespeare play. And I found little or no evidence that working men and women took Shakespeare to heart. On the contrary, more typical was Charlie, a hard-working newspaper boy who lived off St. Martin's Lane in Covent Garden, and whose views on the theatre were recorded by the engineer Charles Manby Smith. He looks upon the drama, which he calls the drama, as the grandest of all our institutions, and he has very original ideas on the subjects of plays and acting. He knows, as he says, lots of tragic speeches and spouts them to his brother Billy as they lie awake in bed, sometimes dropping off to sleep in the middle of a soliloquy. He knows, of course, that Hamlet is first-rate, and Macbeth the same, but his sympathies go with that little pig-tailed tar in the shiny hat who, hitching up his canvas trousers with one hand and shaking a short, dumpy cutlass in the other, hacks and hews his way through a whole regiment of redcoats who surprise him in the smuggler's cave and gets clear off, leaving half of his adversaries dead on the stage. Well, if that was happening in England, what on earth was going on over here, on this side of the Atlantic? One answer, I think, is that America in the 19th century was in love with public speaking, with oratory, on the stump, from the pulpit, in the Senate. Words, as a largely Protestant country knew well, were the most powerful weapons in the world. They could rouse pilgrims to cross an ocean, inspire a revolution, and change the course of a continent. Americans and immigrants alike learned Shakespeare from school teachers and traveling elocutionists who drilled their pupils to declaim the great soliloquies. And they became the stuff of everyday speech. A newspaper report of a domestic assault, a gunfight between rival land claimants, or a dispute between heirs was scarcely complete without a reference to Othello, Macbeth, or King Lear. When Mark Twain wrote about his years as an apprentice pilot on a Mississippi steamboat, one of his most vivid memories was of his master's passion for the bard. He would read Shakespeare to me, Twain recalled, not just casually by the hour, but by the hour, when it was his watch and I was steering. He did not use the book and did not need to. He knew his Shakespeare as well as Euclid ever knew his multiplication table. I wonder whether the frontiersman's exuberant language didn't also have more than a little in common with the outreaching Elizabethan tongue. Both were young and free, robust but flexible, coarsely seasoned, and continually expanding to encompass a brave new world. Yet, I think there was also something beyond mere familiarity that attracted frontier audiences to Shakespeare. And from my research, I think it was this. 19th century America was an unprecedented experiment in building a new society from the ground up, and its pioneers were faced with fundamental questions. How far could individual freedom be cultivated before it started to encroach on the rights of others? To what extent would the human propensity for evil unmask itself if unchecked by laws? Shakespeare seemed to offer answers, or at least raise the questions, in stories that were as big and strong and bold as the West itself. That must be why the plays that most struck a chord with New America were the great tragedies, in which Macbeth and Lear warn about the perils of ambition and the price of guilt, generational conflict and the complacency of power, and Hamlet struggles to keep the flame of moral integrity alive in a shady world. Shakespeare's age, after all, confronted many of the same issues the pioneers faced, the loss of old religious certainties and the challenge of the unknown. When one ranch hand heard the dogs of war speech from Julius Caesar for the first time, he was knocked over. "Gosh," he cried, "that fellow Shakespeare could sure spill the real stuff. He's the only poet I ever seen what was fed on raw meat." With their message that we make our world ourselves and our character, with the message that we make our world ourselves and our character and choices determine our fortunes, they were epically human plays for an epically human world. James Fenimore Cooper called Shakespeare the great author of America and declared that Americans had just as good right as the English to claim him for their countrymen. And some went further and claimed William Shakespeare as an honorary American citizen. The new world, they insisted, embodied the bard's spirit better than his own country. By the time he turned 30, Edwin Forrest was the wealthiest actor in the world and the undisputed king of American popular culture. There was only one challenge left to prove that he was the greatest living actor. That meant pitting himself against the best, and there was only one place to do that, which was London. So he set sail in 1836, with his fans following him down the New York harbor in hired boats, and that October he thudded onto the stage of the Theatre Royal Drury Lane. Forrest turned out to be just what London's jaded audiences had been looking for. He'd put in years of study to make up for his patchy education, but it was his arresting stage presence, his startling way of plunging from savage fury to dewy-eyed tenderness, and above all, his sheer brawn that astonished them. His figure is cast in the proportions of the Farnese Hercules, the Atlas sighed. He was almost too muscular, it added, but his head and neck are perfect models of grandeur in the order to which they belong. The Sun's review was most revealing of mainstream London's tastes. Forrest, it acknowledged, was not, strictly speaking, a classical actor. He was not burdened with refined sensibility, which none but the select few can understand. Far otherwise, he gives free play to those rough natural passions which are intelligible all the world over. If anyone could revive the half-extinct taste for the drama, the newspaper added, he was the man. This made uncomfortable reading for the man who believed he was the first actor of the age, William Charles Macready. The snub was intentional because Forrest's debut had been orchestrated by Macready's nemesis, a frivolous impresario named Alfred Bunn, who then dominated the London theatres. Like many theatre managers, Bunn loathed actors with a vengeance, and he particularly loathed Macready, who had gotten so steamed up after a long string of humiliations at Bunn's hands that shortly before Forrest arrived, Macready lost control and burst into Bunn's office at Drury Lane, fists flying, and pinned him to the floor before Bunn tried to bite his little finger and screamed, "Murder!" Macready had been born into a provincial theatre family, but educated for better things, for the law, until his father went bankrupt and he was forced to tread the boards. He soon discovered that the status of actors had not improved much since they were included in the 1572 Act for the Punishment of Vagabonds, which sent Shakespeare and his contemporaries scurrying for the cover of royal patronage. Or since the 17th century Commonwealth, when one Roundhead called actors the very dregs of man, the shame, the blemish of our English nation, the very instruments of sin and Satan. Drunkenness and vice still hung round the stage door. Performance standards were abysmally low, and Macready's morose and impatient temper was sorely tried by the nightly degradations. What are players? He asked himself in his diary, and he had the answer ready. The refuse of trades, discarded servants, in short, idle persons from every low stage of society. They are low men of low extraction, uneducated and unrestrained in their naked baseness by any moral or gentlemanly feeling. Tormented by social insecurity, Macready devoted his life to raising the standards and dignity of the English stage. He practiced every day to scrape away the declamatory style he'd been taught, tying his hands together and standing against a wall while whispering bursts of rage, or watching in mirrors to make sure he wasn't striking a pose. He sat up all night studying Shakespeare's plays and eventually managed to restore nearly all the texts, which had been sunk beneath 2 centuries of rewriting that turned Romeo and Juliet into a Roman toga piece, inserted comedy sailors into The Tempest, and gave King Lear a happy ending. But however hard he tried, it was never enough. An English actor could never earn the rank of a gentleman and be received at court. Humiliation made Macready a political radical, and ironically, given what would happen later, he dreamed of emigrating to America. Either because of that, or because he was on best behaviour following his now notorious fight with Bunn, Macready welcomed Edwin Forrest to London with unusual warmth, calling on him repeatedly and inviting him to his home to dine with his friends, including his dearest friend, Charles Dickens. Another of Macready's friends, a popular ballad singer, had a beautiful and coquettishly forward 19-year-old daughter named Kate, and for the first time Forrest fell in love. He patriotically did everything he could to resist, including trying to get it out of his system by leaving on a spectacularly carnal grand tour of Europe. But they married in June 1837, the same week the 18-year-old Victoria was enthroned as queen. Before he left England, Forrest wrote to his mother that Macready had behaved in the handsomest manner toward me and had extended to me many delicate courtesies and attentions, all showing the native kindness of his heart and great refinement and good breeding. 6 years later, he had the chance to return the favour when Macready set out on his own tour of America. Forrest threw the Englishman a huge party at his large Chelsea townhouse with its first folio of Shakespeare in pride of place on a velvet-lined stand in his library. And Macready told his diary that he liked Forrest very much. He appears a clear-headed, honest, kind man. What can be better? It all seemed very jolly, and the two men got together several times. But soon enough, things started to go badly wrong. Wherever he went in America, Macready was disconcerted to find Edwin Forrest already encamped in the rival theatre in the same town, as often as not playing the same character in the same play. In the interval since Forrest's visit to London, relations between Britain and America had broken down. Dickens was part of the problem. Following in Fanny Tromp's footsteps, he had first published a scathing travelogue called American Notes that sent America apoplectic, and then a novel, Martin Chuzzlewit, that caricatured Yankees so unsparingly that he started receiving transatlantic hate mail. At the same time, America and Britain were again embroiled in territorial disputes. The crisis is at last on us, the New York Herald warned. The crisis involving questions of the annexation of Texas, the negotiations on the Oregon Territory, and probably war with Mexico and England. Forrest and Macready were now the two undisputed stars of the English-speaking theatre. At a time when actors travelled far more widely than politicians, they were the best-known public faces of their nations. As Macready's tour reached the South, he began to realize that he was one side of a deepening argument over the future direction of American culture. Along with talk of a real war, the new culture war filled the newspapers. The majority came down on the side of Forrest, our great national tragedian. Those who see a superiority in Macready over our great actor must be blinded by prejudice, scoffed the St. Louis Republican. For not only have foreign critics pronounced him great, but the applause forced from the coldest spectators of his efforts manifests that skill as an actor which Macready fails in. Whiggish papers hit back by extolling the subtler virtues of the English actor. The American elite had never much cared for Forrest, and it was growing increasingly tired of his proudly warm populism and his rowdy bahoys. It wanted the bard done their way, which meant English style, not frontier style. As Macready's tour neared its end, the tone turned overtly nationalistic. Native Americanism versus foreignism. Which of the two to choose? Why, Forrest, of course, a Philadelphia paper advised. Macready responded with a curtain speech in which he referred to some unworthy attempts that had been made to excite a prejudice against me and my countrymen engaged in this profession on the plea of being foreigners. It was his first politically charged pronouncement before an American public, but far from his last and far from wise. 2 months after Macready went home, Forrest set out for England. When he opened in London with Othello, hissing assailed him from 3 levels. When he played Macbeth 4 days later, the audience, his co-star wrote, shouted with laughter and hissed him to death. After just a few weeks, he was playing for virtually nothing, and the engagement came to a swift end. It was the first defeat of his life. Politics undoubtedly had a lot to do with this hostile reception. Forrest was billed as the eminent tragedian, the representative of his nation. And in Europe, America's reputation was at an all-time low. In the wake of a deep depression, several states had either defaulted on debt repayments or simply torn up their bonds, most of which were held by English banks. The London papers were full of stories of ruined widows whose pensions were invested in state bonds. One printed an enormously long and vicious attack on America, which it dismissed as a vast deposit of human dregs. Naturally, it was widely reprinted on the other side of the Atlantic and caused outrage. But however overblown, the anger at what was known as repudiation was genuine. The country is disgraced in Europe, reported James Gordon Bennett, the editor of the New York Herald. It had lost its respectable position amongst the nations of the earth. Like most actors, Forrest never thought of looking outside the theatre for an explanation for his troubles. And as he pieced together the evidence for what he assumed must have been a grand plot, he grew convinced that Macready had orchestrated the demonstrations against him. It was certainly true that English tastes had changed since Forrest's last trip, mainly because Macready's school of acting appealed to the increasingly sober Victorian age. But it never crossed Forrest's mind that there was anything wrong with his performances. Years of adulation and stardom left no room for self-doubt. I never acted better in my life. I never before achieved such a performance of Lear, he wrote to a friend. What a pity it could not have been photographed. I mean, the entire representation of the character, with all its power, with all its changeful passions, with all its unspeakable subtleties. Leaving London, Forrest set off on a tour of the English regions and Ireland, where he was much better received. On March 1st, 1846, he arrived in Edinburgh, and the next day he took advantage of a night off to see his old friend, now his arch-rival, in Hamlet. Macready reached the players' scene. He gave Hamlet's famous direction to the actors. He told Horatio that he'd set the mousetrap to catch the conscience of the king, and as the court entered, he muttered the simple line, "They are coming to the play. I must be idle. Get you a place." Macready interpreted be idle as act foolish, pretend to be crazy, which is probably the right reading. He walked rapidly back and forth across the stage, bobbed his head from side to side, pulled out his handkerchief, took it by the corner, and twirled it in the air while dancing a little hopping jig. An almighty hiss came from a box to the right of the stage. A hiss, said the actor playing Macduff, like the exhaust from a steam engine. Macready bowed derisively and waved his handkerchief even harder. The audience booed the hisser. "Turn him out," came a cry from the students' gallery, and eventually a large figure stood up and slowly turned away. The next day, Edinburgh was abuzz with rumours that the hisser was none other than the eminent American tragedian. Macready, standing in the footlights, had not made him out, and at first he refused to believe it. After days of newspaper innuendo, Forrest wrote a long letter to the Times, in which he not only acknowledged he was the hisser, but defended the hiss on the grounds that Macready's handkerchief dance was an effeminate travesty of the manly dignity of a star. Ridiculously, the controversy spread across the Atlantic and rumbled on long after Forrest went home in August. He had brought with him a burning grudge, and he shared it with anyone who would listen. His friends took up his cause with a vengeance, and they were still nursing their anger 2 years later when Macready returned to the United States. On his first day back in New York, Macready was hissed and jeered and pelted with coins and eggs. He defended himself in more unwise curtain speeches, and Forrest replied with increasingly bad-tempered letters in the papers, in which he called Macready, among much else, a superannuated driveller. "Oh, Mr. Forrest," Macready exclaimed in his diary, after numerous outbursts at his rival's staggering and atrocious villainy, "I felt the blow he had struck upon his own head, but yet was uncertain how far the low class under his influence might be affected by it. Sent for 3 dozen of the papers instantly." Macready responded with a card of his own and threatened legal action. As he toured the South, he found himself the toast of society. But in Cincinnati, after his handkerchief dance in Hamlet, the raw carcass of half a sheep came flying down from the gallery and thudded onto the center of the stage. Whether, as one writer suggested, from a mere ebullition of amiable vivacity or something stronger, no one seems to have discovered. Meanwhile, Forrest fired off a series of enormously long letters to the papers, running through his grievances point by point. The day Macready returned to New York for the last part of his tour, the papers were also full of gossip about Forrest's scandalous separation from his English wife, Kate, which cut Forrest's final tie with England and left him more bitter and self-righteous than ever. A personal and an international feud had converged in one fraught moment. Macready's determination to make the theatre respectable had made him the archetype of the Victorian Englishman. Forrest's frontier populism had made him the hero of a new America. The predominance of the theatre had thrust both onto an international stage. The competitiveness of their profession had fostered a jealous rivalry, and years of being stars had excised a sense of proportion from both men. English abuse had worn America's patience thin, and American expansionism and indebtedness had raised England's hackles. Even Forrest's marital troubles had added to the crisis. Not least, America's conflicted relationship with its heritage had split the nation into 2 opposing camps, and both were determined to claim Shakespeare as their own. The stage was set for a showdown, but there was one final trigger ready to trip into place. Excuse me for a second. In 1849, New York was a city of 2 halves. 200,000 immigrants were arriving each year, half from Ireland, and the tide of humanity turned large tracts of the city into slums. As wages plummeted, nativism surged, and American and Irish youths formed themselves into rival gangs with names like the Plug Uglies and Dead Rabbits. But the one thing that united Irish and nativists alike was hatred of England and the Anglophile American aristocracy. Uptown in their brownstone mansions with their liveried footmen and elaborate dinners served on Sèvres porcelain, the elite was terrified that it was losing control of its city. 2 years earlier, they had abandoned the old theatres and built a temple to the drama in Astor Place, a soothing realm of velvet sofas, pearl opera glasses, and debutantes adjusting their ringlets at the end of each act. The strict dress code, freshly shaven faces, evening dress, fresh waistcoats, and kid gloves, which required the purchase of an expensive dress and thus the use of a carriage, was deliberately designed to weed out the hoi polloi. Macready was booked to open there on May 7th in Macbeth. That night, Forrest was announced in the same play at the vast Broadway Theatre. To Forrest's supporters, the Astor Place Theatre, which was also known as the Opera House, was a direct challenge to American democracy, and Macready's appearance was a golden opportunity to attack both England and the Upper Ten, as the elite were known, in one fell swoop. For the Englishman's opening night, Forrest's friends quietly bought up 500 tickets, applying for small numbers at each of the major hotels. Inside the theatre, they unfurled banners, cheered Forrest, hurled increasingly heavy objects at the stage, and forced Macready off after the third act. Till the early hours, Forrest's fans marched jubilantly through the streets, chanting the witches' chorus from Macbeth. When shall we three meet again, in thunder, lightning, or in rain, when the hurly-burly's done, when the battle's lost or won? Lost and won, sorry. The next day, Macready had already sent to a steamship to book his passage home, when a delegation headed by Washington Irving arrived at his hotel. Irving, the elder statesman of American writers, presented Macready with a letter signed by 48 of New York's leading citizens, requesting you to reconsider your decision and assuring you that the good sense and respect for order prevailing in this community will sustain you on the subsequent nights of your performances. Macready consulted his sense of propriety and agreed to play Macbeth one more time. That day, the official returns of the mayoral elections were read out at City Hall. Caleb S. Woodhull, the patrician's candidate, won by a large majority. On Thursday, May 10th, Woodhull met with city officials to consider the case. Overnight, posters had been pasted everywhere with blatant appeals to national prejudice. "Working men, shall Americans or English rule in this city?" one began, calling all Americans to express their opinions at the English aristocratic opera house. Forrest's friend, Isaiah Reinders, a notorious Democratic ward heeler, turned out to be behind it, and behind another poster that decried Americans as low curs and called on Englishmen to mount their own show of force at the theatre. Meanwhile, the papers that morning were full of evidence that Macready had requested from England, proving his innocence of the charges levelled at him by Forrest. The mayor took a deep breath and ordered several companies of infantry, cavalry, and artillery from the state militia to assemble. That evening, between 10 and 20,000 demonstrators poured into Astor Place and the surrounding streets. Inside, Macbeth started with the witches' scene. The management had gone to great lengths to keep Forrest fans out, but some had managed to get tickets, and they groaned and hissed and shook their fists. Macready's supporters stood up and cheered. Some of the 325 policemen on the scene dragged out the worst offenders and locked them up in a storeroom under the parquet, where they set fire to some shavings and straw. Smoke seeped into the auditorium. Officers charged into the storeroom, stamped out the flames, and clapped the arsonists in irons, and the play went on. But towards the end of the second act, a terrible noise came through the boarded-up windows. Near the theatre, a sewer was in mid-construction, and heaps of cobblestones were lying around. Relays of gangsters gathered armfuls of the stones and let loose volley after volley, methodically pounding the doors and windows from the Bowery end toward Broadway. Others knocked out the street lamps, so they couldn't easily be seen. The barrage dislodged the planks nailed over the windows, and they began falling into the auditorium. "Fight, fight, tear it down," the mob chanted. "Burn the damned den of the aristocracy!" The mob took aim at the police and many retreated into the lobby, blood streaming down their faces. In charge of the hardcore was Ned Buntline, a dime novelist, muckraking journalist, and nativist rabble-rouser. "Let's see Ned Forrest put through," he whooped to loud cheers. Buntline charged up and down, swinging a Roman broadsword, and his hoodlums hurled themselves at the entrance and burst the doors. A new squad of police charged out, but in the full-scale battle that followed, they lost control. Just in time, the cavalry rode in, but the mob had scented victory, and the appearance of uniformed soldiers unleashed fury. Stones flew at the hussars and their white horses, which were trained for parade duty rather than crowd control, and reared under the assault. Several riders were pulled to the ground. The rest were driven off, their faces covered in blood. Behind them, the regular thud of the infantry's boots broke up as they pushed blindly through, attacked and insulted on either side. The soldiers managed to get to the theatre, but the front rank was knocked down by another bombardment of stones, and they were carried bleeding inside. An injured general repeatedly told the mayor that his men would leave the ground unless he gave the order to fire. On stage, the fifth act began, and Macready pointed all his defiance at his unseen enemies. "I flung my whole soul into every word I uttered," he later boasted to his diary, exciting the audience to a sympathy even with the glowing words of fiction, while those dreadful deeds of real crime and outrage were roaring at intervals in our ears and rising to madness all around us. His resolve thrilled his audience. Though with the fierce yells and the crashing stones, it didn't take a leap of the imagination to conjure up an army bearing down on the Thanes castle. One critic later declared he had never seen the fifth act of Macbeth so splendidly and perfectly performed. Macready came out for his curtain call, emphatically bowed his thanks, signalled his sympathy to the audience, and quitted the American stage. Outside, a fierce hail of stones rattled off the infantry's muskets and sent up a shower of sparks. Pistols flashed in the crowd. Finally, the city officials gave the order to fire. A sulphurous flare and the bullets flew. The rioters thought the soldiers were using blank cartridges, and they surged forward. The order to fire was given again and again. Smoke hung in the air, stinging the eyes. When it cleared, it revealed at least 25 people dead or dying, and well over 100 injured. The rioters carried their comrades through the streets to drugstores and saloons, vowing revenge. Macready, meanwhile, had slipped out in disguise among the departing audience and was driven from town. Throughout the night, mobs chased omnibuses and swept trains, threatening to hunt him down and kill him. The riots continued for 5 days, with mass meetings in City Hall Park and running battles between the troops and the Bahoys, until the elite finally took back control of its city. Macready escaped to England and retired 2 years later, relieved to be rid of his troublesome profession. Edwin Forrest's name was blackened by his role in the riot and by a scandalous 38-day-long divorce trial from Kate. His fans continued to worship him, but eventually time and tastes overtook him. The Bahoys disappeared into the Bowery's vaudeville and variety shows, while to audiences in the newly respectable theatres uptown, he was too much the matinee idol. One American critic summed up his style in the 1860s, I think, as the muscular school, the brawny art, the biceps aesthetics, the tragic calves, the bovine drama. The two men died 4 months apart, towering talents who were remembered for a riot that was only partly of their making. That's because of the transitory nature of acting before recording, but also because of the way history writing resolves around controversies and oppositions, a process in which I fully realise I'm complicit. Perhaps the greatest loser, though, was Shakespeare. The riot happened because every class in America believed that Shakespeare belonged to them. No one would have fought over opera or drawing room comedy. But in the wake of the riot, the bard was removed to a realm labelled high culture, where he was performed with due deference in silent theatres and taught in schools as a perplexing puzzle of metrics and syntax. And everyone forgot that regular men and women had laughed and gasped at his plays 200 years after they were written. The notion of playing Shakespeare to the crowd would revive, but his plays would never again be so genuinely popular. Can anyone imagine Americans taking to the streets in their thousands to decide who owned the Bard? So, 9 days before we mark the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death, let's remember that there really was a time when one writer's voice carried a people across a continent and helped forge a brave new world.
There will be some time for questions. If anybody has any, start us off.
So,
Thanks.
was the popularity of Shakespeare also back in colonial America too? I mean, did it carry forward from the 1600s? Or was this
Yeah, it was slow to come in on the stage because there were a lot of Puritans who closed down every theatre that was opened. But it was read and prized right from the beginning. There are lots of stories of politicians who read Shakespeare and who were inspired by his speeches and he was, as literature, he was hugely influential. But there was a sort of prejudice against Shakespeare in performance, and that didn't really lift till the 18th century. And George Washington had a lot to do with it. He was theatre mad, and it became fashionable to go to the theatre in Washington and along the East Coast, really, as a result of his lead. There was one theatre riot, actually, just before the Revolution, when Shakespeare was being done in New York in a wooden theatre, and I don't know, some rioters, some demonstrators came and climbed in through the windows, shooed the audience out, and took the theatre apart, plank by plank, went and stuck it on a great big pile and made a bonfire of it. So, I mean, this opposition between English Shakespeare and American Shakespeare dates back, certainly 100 years before this story is set.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about how the riots were received in England? Was it just evidence of Americans out of control?
I mean, it very much fitted into the story that was being told at the time. This repudiation scandal, which has been forgotten these days, was a big thing. There was an enormous amount of indebtedness in England as a result of it. People were going bankrupt by the thousand, and so Americans were being pretty much roundly reviled in the press. And this was just another story of beastly Americans being horrible to the English. And certainly, Dickens, who made as much of it as he could, and his friend John Foster, who was also a friend of John Foster, was a friend of Macready's as well. And there were pretty savage comments in the press about it, and I think Forrest was sort of exhibited in pothouse windows and stuff like that in caricature. But of course, it was more of a thing in America, in New York, than it was back in England.
One of the key phrases that kind of stood out to me as you described Shakespeare's work was epically human. So given that was centuries ago that it was written, do you feel that today's culture still reflects that sense of epically human as related to Shakespeare? And if not, what kind of discrepancies do you notice?
That's a big question. Yeah, I mean, I think that particular need for Shakespeare went away in a sort of political or social sense. I don't think that you can see people looking to Shakespeare's plays for advice on how to behave these days, which they absolutely did then. Some people used to say that Shakespeare's characters were like their friends, and they turned to them for advice. And I think that what I was saying about people on the frontier looking for answers, it's absolutely true. People had the King James Bible on their shelf, and they had the collected works of Shakespeare, and they read them, all the time, and they looked to them for advice. So I think that sort of, that world, which I called epically human, was sort of ripe for the sort of universal quality of Shakespeare's thought, of his presentation of societies and different models of society. But obviously, that America went away, and it's not something, I don't think anywhere. Do you think there's somewhere in the world today where people are reading Shakespeare and saying we must construct our society differently because Shakespeare says this? I guess not.
So, given that answer, so obviously during that time period there was a lot of conflict created by Shakespeare, right? So, do you think that Shakespearean works have lost that power to incite a social conflict of some sort because they're not as relevant?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I think the conflict was not created by Shakespeare's works, his words, as much as by political forces trying to manipulate or find what they wanted in those words. And of course, you can find an awful lot in Shakespeare to prove your case, whichever side it might be on. So, yeah, I mean, I think this all has to be set in the context of this 19th century adoration of Shakespeare, when there were statues to him going up everywhere in Central Park and all around America. Like I say, there were Shakespeare schooners, there were Shakespeare steamers, there were Shakespeare saloons, there were Shakespeare hotels, Shakespeare roads, Shakespeare mines, and everything. I mean, he was ubiquitous, and I think that this political debate over whether he represented, as the Americans at the time would have seen, or the Forest Americans would have seen, an aristocratic British culture, or whether he represented an American, as they thought, an American democratic culture, a sort of self-seeking, self-striving culture. I mean, that debate, happened because he was everywhere. I mean, if Shakespeare hadn't been so popular and another poet had happened to catch on and be the greatest dramatist of the world, then that other poet might have been subject to the same political debates.
Yeah, in the back.
How has the role of the national tragedian changed since the 19th century when the events from the book take place?
There isn't one, is there?
No, I'm curious what marked the decline of that conversation.
I think that Forrest was the first American star and America's actor. He was the first actor to become a national star, a national celebrity, and it was possible to label him as America's greatest actor, America's actor, because of that. I guess that situation changed fairly rapidly, and there were a number of postulants, who came fairly swiftly after him. In England, I mean, Macready was known as the eminent tragedian. Is it tragedian or tragedian? I'm never quite sure. One's American and one's English. I can't remember.
I've heard either one.
But he was known as the eminent, but he had some rivals. Edmund Kean was still around when he was a young man, and Kean was all over the place, but he was still an extraordinary actor, and he had his supporters, the Wolves, who tried to get Macready off the stage and so forth. So Macready had a few years in England when he was the great English actor, and it coincides with the Riot, probably about a decade. But then there were others who came along later, and in a way, he was, I guess, the last of the great actor-managers of the old style, because you get people like Herbert Beerbohm-Tree, who was knighted and became a respectable gentleman. So Macready sort of prepared the way for that to happen, but he didn't get the gong because he was the one who made it possible.
So you get, partly by the late 19th century, sort of a field of stars. So you don't have one central sort of tragedian, but you have a series. You have,
Yeah,
especially when film starts to pick up.
Right. And I mean, even in America in the 1860s, you already get quite a crop of stars. The Booths and Charlotte Cushman and people like that, who are big celebrities. So I think this period in the 1840s was also unique for that reason, that Macready had no opponents, and he sort of peculiarly represented that Victorian style of English serious highbrow culture. And Forrest had no opponents either in America, and peculiarly represented that new style of acting that I suppose you could say went through to early Hollywood, a sort of robust, heroic, matinee idol style of acting.
Yeah, right over here.
You've seen some of the players' books and memorabilia in our exhibition, the booths, one of them in particular that you mentioned. To what degree did Forrest have any bridge with that next generation of actors, either by training or that they saw him or he helped influence their career?
Right. I mean, my feeling, it's a difficult question to answer, but my feeling is that he had more of a long-term effect in the sense of creating an American style of acting, making it possible to be an American actor and find a different way of acting than the English had, rather than having any sort of immediate effect on people that followed him. He didn't have disciples. And to be honest, he probably didn't want disciples either. He became a rather lonely figure in his later years. And I think he'd sort of succumbed to the star ego in the same way that Macready did as well. Only he was sort of held back slightly by the fact that he couldn't stand the theatre. So he didn't really value it when people praised him. But Forrest absolutely did, and it did go to his head, I think, and he really thought he was the greatest thing in the world, and his letters are full of self-praise and resentment of other actors who started challenging him. So I think he was a sort of one-man band, and he didn't have a sort of troupe of followers who copied him.
We have great examples of those letters in the Ransom Center collections, actually. Especially in those later years, you get the sense of resentment of people not remembering who he was or his gift, but also just the sort of loneliness actually that he's asking constantly for people to accompany him to his country estate. It's you get that sense, that shift.
I have to see these letters.
Yeah.
But there are some rather sort of sad scenes of people. He used to stick on his costumes. He had all this. I mean, he loved the theatre. He was a man of the theatre, and he had all of these props and costumes and stuff. And he used to, put them on and go in his back garden with a friend and run up and down, doing his shows on his own when he was in his 60s and he couldn't get a gig. So,
in a wild youth. Yeah. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Thank you again for coming. Again, there's programs and calendars outside in the lobby. Come back and see us.